Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
So first of all, the June 2010 plan, let's go back and consider what that was. The coalition set a course for government spending that represented really its defining mission to eliminate the structural deficit on the current budget within 5 years. That was then before the next election. Then the spending review later that year in October set out how the pain of those cuts should be shared across different departments and also across some social security spending. The plan was for a shortish, sharp shock. And all that remained, once the political pain of those plans had been announced, was just to implement it. But the plan's gone awry. Since then, the economy hasn't gone to plan, and as a result, substantial cuts or tax rises will now be required after that target year of 2014-15. And where those cuts are going to fall will be decided at the next spending review. It hasn't been said by the government where it will get that money from. So how big is that challenge? Well, this autumn on December the 5th, or this winter perhaps, we will hear more from the Office for Budget Responsibility, which will tell us how big the problem is, and will really set out the challenge that will define the next spending review, which we hear may take place in autumn next year, when this pile of cuts that are required after that 14-15 year will be decided. The plan was that in 16-17 the government would be spending something in the order of £724 billion in that target year. And that money was comprised of two broad parts of government expenditure: departmental expenditure limits, that's spending on public services as we know it, and social security. Now, after last November, after the OBR reported, the government said, okay, well, we're going to have to cut total spending by 15 billion in that target year to make sure that we hit our target of getting rid of the deficit. But that wasn't the whole story. Social security spending tends to rise on its own, partly because of growing numbers of people above state pension age, and partly because of things like rents increasing faster than inflation, which pushes up housing benefit. So without a decision to cut those levels, a discretionary decision to cut those levels of state pension or housing benefit, social security goes on rising, which means that if you've got a set amount of money, it eats into your departmental spending. So the amount of money that's left for government departments to spend shrinks. And by 2016-17, that squeeze would require another 11 billion of savings from somewhere in order to keep the spending plans on track. But since then, things have got a lot worse, and this is where we've done most of our work. Growth has been weaker than it was expected to be, and as a result, government borrowing is currently running above the planned path of it. You can see on the right-hand side there, this is the cumulative borrowing over the months of the year that the government's making. And you can see that red dot in the top right-hand corner is what the OBR forecast borrowing would be this year. And the lighter green dot at the top is what it will be if the current level of overshoot persists for the rest of the year. 10% more money being borrowed. But paradoxically, we know that unemployment's been falling, which suggests a little bit worryingly that the economy is using more of the resources, the spare resources that were idle, and is therefore perhaps closer to its potential level of output than we previously thought it would be. So obviously, if the economy is at its potential level, then all of the borrowing you see must be eliminated through cuts or tax rises. Whereas if the economy is slightly below its potential level, then the bounce back will take up some of that slack. So what does the picture look like? Well, this chart shows the OBR's estimate and ours superimposed, our replica. And you can see that before, that bit at the beginning of the graph, is before 2007, before the crash. So the economy was performing above its sustainable rate, which is obviously a good indicator that there's a recession coming. Then you have the crash and a big negative output gap, as it's called, the economy well below what its potential level is. You can see in the last 3 quarters there, which is our update, that on this, the OBR's to-date preferred measure of the output gap has closed further. So the economy is closer to its potential level even though the economy has been performing very poorly over the past year. Since it's closer to its potential, a higher proportion of government borrowing will remain when things do finally return to normal, i.e. that x-axis line there. So what does all that mean? Well, it means we've got 11 billion of cuts to offset the rising social security bill. We've got 15 billion of cuts announced last autumn, and we've got a further 22 billion, our application of the Treasury's method for estimating how much is a permanent part of the deficit, giving a total of 48 billion pounds worth of cuts that would now be required by 2017-18 to hit the government's target to eliminate the structural deficit and achieve its previous plans, the plans it set out in the budget. There's a lot of charts in the report itself about what this will mean for individual departments at the next spending review, and we show that if no departments have their spending protected, they'll have to see a 11% fall in departmental spending across the board if we take the government at its word that it will not raise taxes and will cut 10.5 billion out of social security spending. If they choose to protect the NHS, the education budget and international development, we're looking at 23% cuts across the remaining departments. So the pie chart on the left shows what happens if all cuts are spread across departments evenly, with no protection for the NHS after 2014-15. And the one on the right shows what happens if those three departments are protected. The total size of the pie is the total spending in 2010. Where the pie ends up is how big the department will be by 2018 in real terms. So you've got really very much smaller departments, which on some scenarios here are almost half the size they were in 2010. And that is really the challenge that faces public services over this decade of cuts. Thanks.
I thought I understood about the deficit, but actually this is truly terrifying. So, Ben, I hope you've got some answers.
Well, I suppose our starting point would be to say that I don't think the picture is quite as rosy as Ian has suggested. Because there are several things you need to take into account, even about the existing cuts, which is that the cuts which were voted through as part of the 2010 spending review, 81 billion of cuts, I think the IFS have estimated that only about 20% of those have yet been implemented. And then on top of that, you've got the 48 billion of further cuts that Ian has outlined. But there are three other factors that I think need to be taken into account if you want to look at the whole picture. The first of those, to some extent the most important, isn't just about the fact that there's less to spend on public services, but that at the same time the demand for public services is rising exponentially. The Local Government Association have looked at the cost of an ageing society and said that by 2020, funding simply existing statutory responsibilities would lead to a 17.5 billion gap. And if they funded them in full, would require 66% of cuts in every other area of local authority services. Secondly, the outcomes that we're getting from our traditionally structured public services are not as good as we might have hoped for. Despite some improvements in public services in the last decade or so, we still lag behind other countries in terms of health inequalities and some of the broader issues around inequalities and educational outcomes. And thirdly, we face a huge challenge thinking about how we can create a sustainable growth strategy for Britain, given that it's not going to come from financial services and property development or public expenditure, which have been the three major sources of growth in the recent past. So if you put those three together and you add those to the fact that there's a severe crisis in terms of the fiscal situation, you've got an even bigger and more depressing picture to think about. We can see a kind of emerging consensus about some of the characteristics of the type of public services we would need in the future to respond to some of the challenges I've identified. We'd need public services much more rooted in social citizenship, which are much more about enhancing responsibility. We'd need them to be more productive, collaborative, insight-driven, integrated, entrepreneurial, and relational. What matters about public services are the outcomes which are created partly by the services themselves and partly by citizens. And in particular, we've identified three principles. rebalancing and realigning public services, what we call citizen-side innovation, and managing for social productivity. And it's often the case that it's cities and city regions that are the right spatial size to be able to implement significant change and to carry public consent with that change. And so we argue we should take something which is a positive development, which are the city deals that have begun to be developed by this government to negotiate powers passed to local government in relation to economic development, and broaden them out to include a much wider range of public services, so that you're able to get a real economy of scale at a city-wide level, and to be able to remove some of the duplications that exist between services, agree priorities at a local level, and also fundamentally create a financial and revenue base which is strong enough for those cities to be competitive internationally. And so we would argue for combining city deals with a sort of total place initiative, which would see very, very significant devolution of Whitehall budgets to localities. There's been a huge emphasis in public service reform in the past 10 to 15 years on supply-side innovation. In other words, thinking about how services can be differently delivered. And much of that is welcome and necessary. But it won't be sufficient unless we also think about how we can engage citizens directly in managing some of the challenges facing themselves and their communities. A number of local authorities around the country are thinking about the way in which they can start to reduce demand for their services, working to create effectively a new social contract with citizens at a local level. Second key area we think is modernising the welfare system to make it far more flexible, so that it properly is able to encourage work that pays, and so the living wage is an important part of that, but so also is a system that enables people to contribute more effectively over a life cycle and draw down from it when they need it, for instance, for training and other things. Thirdly, there needs to be a next generation of digital services in which the public sector properly embraces the opportunity that's there for online services. For us, one of the key tests of a proper review is how you can ensure that more public expenditure is spent on productive areas of public services, training, education, infrastructure. All of this calls for a very big change in our public service model, which is going to require a degree of consent and legitimacy to be built for it, which it will probably have to start both from the top down and from the bottom up. There are some local authorities that are beginning this process, but what we would want to see, given the scale of choices that we now face, is that a strategic spending review properly articulates the options and enables the public to take part in that discussion.
Everything you're suggesting sounds like the kinds of imaginative reshaping which one could undertake if one had a lot of money and a lot of time, but there's neither money nor time. How would one get from where we are now to where you would like to be at a time of financial stringency? I don't see it.
Well, two things. Firstly, some of it is happening, and funnily enough, there are local authorities faced with already very deep cuts and knowing that they're going to have even deeper cuts to come, who've decided to, rather than just hunker down, to think about how are they going to manage the long-term challenges facing their communities, and are already going through the restructuring we're talking about. Secondly, it seems to me that governments have got to move away from the kind of Napoleonic complex that they had, believing that in the shrunken world that they now operate in terms of their own legitimacy, that they can make this change happen on their own. They can't. And what I think they're going to need to do is think much more about how they create a consensus with other organisations in society.
Michael, you of course were a pioneer in government of the whole Total Place initiative, so what's your response to today's challenges?
We don't do enough, despite the work in some local authorities you mentioned, Ben, to reduce demand on services by early intervention. We've just cut the grant, by prevention, or through behavioural change. And if, I have to say, a private sector organisation was facing this crisis, the first thing they'd try and do would be to reduce demand. So we're not doing that. If you look at a very practical level, Age UK, I noticed a couple of weeks ago, were saying if every hospital in this country had a strategy for identifying at early stage dementia and then managing effectively, they could save 6 million a year in each hospital. You could go on and on and on listing where we're missing the issue of prevention. We have a public service model which is about respond, protect, prevent, when we need a model which is about prevent, protect, respond. We don't have it. I'm on a select committee moment looking at the issue of ageing. I was struck by the fact that the Australians have a vision for an ageing society. They have a minister for ageing. They've got a strategy which is properly costed. One of the biggest problems facing our society, and we are dealing with it in the usual piecemeal way across government. We've been slow to explore potential new sources of funding. I mean, I don't think our traditional funding model is going to be able to cope with demand, even if we manage to reduce the demand. So why couldn't we be a bit quicker picking up issues like social investment for some of you social impact bonds? I think we've been pretty slow. Hats off to the big lottery, which has just invested £40 million of their resources into enhancing outcome payments for social impact bonds. But it's not just social impact bonds. We've been slow, I think, to look at the potential of pension funds, and we should be. Actually, the think tanks, the Treasury, should be really focusing on this as an issue. We've talked endlessly about localism, but we've actually devolved very few additional powers. What we've actually been doing is a bit of deregulation and delegating the privilege of being blamed for cost cutting. And have a look, if you don't believe me, have a look at the council tax fund, which I think is a poll tax waiting to happen, which very few people seem to have picked up. We're actually delegating to local authorities the privilege of being beaten around the head for asking people who've never paid never paid council tax to pay, and then they've got to collect the small amounts of money that they will be demanding. That's what happened in the poll tax. We have, as you say, we've failed to understand the importance of commissioning outcomes, and we've carried on preferring a model of direct delivery. So we've certainly got nowhere near to understanding that commissioning could realise social and economic benefits, as well as just reducing costs through outsourcing. And we haven't built up commissioning skills within government. I really don't want to mention the West Coast franchise, but if you think that's a one-off, I can tell you it's an accident waiting to happen, and it's repeated fairly regularly on a smaller scale. You talk in the report also about using public services productivity for economic growth. It's something we did 15, 20 years ago in a small way with childcare. We realised that actually by encouraging people to set up small companies to provide childcare, you could actually stimulate the economy. Why can't we do something similar like that for an ageing population? And what about empowering individuals, which you talk about? I mean, both parties seem to be scared stiff about empowering individuals for fear of being accused of using this as a route to further cost cutting. And I think we need to have a serious, mature debate about how we could empower people to support themselves and how we can support them to do that task. If we're going to do that, then we need to look afresh at how we design services around clients and how we integrate digital technology. I think we're well behind with things like telemedicine and telecare, which can actually bring benefits both to the individual and to the public purse. But I don't know of a department that has got a service designer in it. I mean, we spend billions, trillions on services every year, and yet we don't see service design as the kind of skill that you should see in government. And there's only one local authority that has got a chief designer, and that's, to their credit, is Cornwall. We can have more of the same public services with less money, which for me is not an attractive option, and for most clients and citizens is not an attractive option. Or we can make a serious attempt to reform a broken model in a way that fits with our national fiscal policy, because if you address those flaws, then there are quite a lot of savings to be made. But sadly, all the evidence suggests that we will once again carry on regardless.
Thank you very much. Can I encourage you all to visit the RSA and SMF websites and perhaps to continue this discussion on Twitter? Yeah. Because this is such a crucially important thing that basically we've all got to go out there and spread the word.